The founder of the American Safety Razor Company in 1901, who changed its name to the Gillette Safety Razor Company in 1902, Gillette published The Human Drift in 1894. While acknowledging that, quote, no reform movement can meet with success unless that movement takes into consideration the power of capital and is based on present business models and conforms to the same laws, end quote, Gillette's Human Drift railed against competition, which he believed was, quote, the prolific source of ignorance in every form of crime, and that which increases the wealth of the few at the expense of the many. The present system of competition between individuals results in fraud, deception, and adulteration of almost every article we eat, drink, or wear, end quote. Competition resulted in, quote, a waste of material and labor beyond calculation, end quote. Competition was the source of, quote, selfishness, war, murder, robbery, lying, prostitution, forgery, divorce, deception, brutality, ignorance, injustice, drunkenness, insanity, suicide, and every other crime, which have their base in competition and ignorance. This explains the recent Gillette ad, after all. The company has finally discovered that the root of competition, and thus of all evil, is toxic masculinity. So, give me another second here. But the corporate socialist King Camp Gillette may as well have patented this disposable safety razor to prevent so many desperate people from cutting their throats, at least until they realized that the answer to all their problems, which he introduced in Human Drift, a singular monopoly, which would, quote, naturally control all production and distribution, specializing in everything, such that, quote, every article sold to consumer, from the package to its contents, will be the product of the United Company. Under the United Company, the production of necessary goods and eventually of everything would be consolidated and centralized, eliminating the wastes and hazards of the many and widely dispersed manufacturing plants and buildings of the current haphazard and chaotic system. Most cities and towns would be, quote, destroyed, as would all competitors, as the vast majority of the population would relocate to the metropolis, where, powered by Niagara Falls, all production would take place, and everyone's lives would center around the corporation, whose commercial and governmental power would be total. Lest anyone think that the Human Drift represented the lark of a young idealist before he came to his senses and founded a company with almost unparalleled name recognition, Gillette went on to publish The World Corporation in 1910, a prospectus for developing a worldwide singular monopoly. But founding his company and patenting his razor between writing these two treatises, Gillette's biographer Russell Adams quipped, it was almost as if Karl Marx had paused between the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital to develop a dissolving toothbrush or collapsible comb. A few passages from World Corporation should be sufficient to establish Gillette as the prototypical corporate socialist. Corporations will continue to form, absorb, expand, and grow, and no power of man can prevent it. Promoters of World Corporation are the true socialists of this generation, the actual builders of the cooperative system, which is eliminating competition and, in practical business, reaching results which socialists have vainly tried to attain through legislation and agitation for centuries. Opposition to World Corporation by individuals, by states, or by governments will be of no avail. Opposition in any case can only be a temporary effect. Barriers will only centralize power and cause increased momentum when they give way. The corporation will also dominate material, but also mental production, as Gillette praises the hive mind. World Corporation represents individual intelligence and force combined, centralized and intelligently directed. Individuals are of the corporate mind, but not the corporate mind. And as if anticipating Google's secret mission statement, Gillette wrote, World Corporation will possess all knowledge of all men, and each individual mind will find complete expression through the great corporate mind. Finally, waxing poetic in Ray Kurzweil mode, Gillette wrote, World corporation will have a life everlasting. Individual man will live his life and pass into the great beyond, but this great corporate mind will live on through the ages, always absorbing and perfecting for the utilization and benefit of all the inhabitants of the earth. It is worth noting that Gillette's business practices were not wholly at odds with his ideas in his books. True to his monopolistic impulses, he regularly filed patents, and in 1917, with the outbreak of World War I, the company provided every soldier with a shaving kit paid for by the U.S. government. But Gillette's expressions of corporate socialism, did Gillette's expressions of corporate socialism actually help his business efforts, or merely ease his guilty conscience, or what? We can't be sure. But speculating about the objectives of today's corporate leftists may help make sense of the rhetoric of such corporate leftists of the past. Back to the contemporary woke capitalism. Today's corporate social justice rebranding represents at least a rhetorical overthrow of Milton Friedman's extremely narrow view of corporate responsibility. In Capitalism and Freedom, 1962, Friedman declared that one and only one social responsibility of business is to increase profits. Friedman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1976, and by the 1950s, his notion of limited corporate social responsibility had become widely accepted. Yet woke capitalism could still satisfy Friedman's profit-only maxim. If all the world's a stage, then the corporate mouthing of social justice bromides may be play acting and therefore mawkish parody. To be truly woke, then, might mean that one is awake to the woke-acting corporations, the woke-believing consumers, and maybe even the demands of wokeness altogether. This explanation is consistent with the profit requirement and allows one to make short shrift of newly found corporate virtue. It is a cynical sham and proves more than ever that the chicanery of corporations and their billionaire owners knows no bounds. This view is very similar to that held by the critic of woke billionaires and author of Winners Take All. Now, as tempting as such post-truth cynicism may be, it doesn't explain the promotion of woke or leftist views by corporations and the effects that such promotions may have in making their consumer bases more leftist in the first place, a circumstance that they will have to deal with at some point. Arguably, corporations would not espouse and thereby potentially spread political views merely to assuage a consumer contingent unless said views aligned ultimately with their own interests. One is led to wonder what politics would best serve the interests of corporate leftists, especially aspiring corporate socialists. To benefit corporate leftists, corporate socialists, or any other monolithic singular producer and governmentality, a political creed would likely place a heavy emphasis on equality. Such an emphasis would likely be accompanied by shaming of the privileged, along with demands that they surrender their advantages. All this takes place in Gillette's books. To emphasize equality, the creed benefiting the corporate leftists would recognize refugees, the disenfranchised, and at least in theory would be internationalist rather than nationalist or nativist. While declaring equality, the political creed of the corporate leftists might nevertheless stress difference endlessly between identity groups and even within them, and might benefit from the creation of utterly new identity types. Such a creed would consistently keep the identity groups concerned with whether or not they were losing ground to other identity groups rather than worrying about the corporate socialists. Watchwords might include such things as equity, inclusion, and diversity. Always on the cutting edge, the corporate leftists would welcome the promotion of the new and disruption of the old, but always with improvement in mind. A political creed that aimed at dismantling traditional gender, the family, local customs, tradition, and even historical memory would remove the last bastions against state or major corporate power. Ultimately, the corporate leftist or corporate socialist would benefit from a singular governmental monopoly with one set of rules. As Gillette noted, ideally, this global government would be the corporation itself. Thus, woke capitalism or corporate leftism does not consist of merely rhetorical placebos, symbolic over economic concessions, or even the mere placating of liberal political elites. Woke capitalism or corporate leftism actually represents the corporate interests of the would-be monopolist, the corporate socialist, and the corporate leftist in general. Thank you.